The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The words of the 23rd Psalm have been heard in many forms throughout any tradition that any of us grew up in. It's in the form of music, taking after the nature of a psalm. It's been read in every version. Some of you may be very familiar with the King James Version. It's been read at weddings. It's been read at funerals. It's been read at just about any service that you can think of at different times in our lives. But most of us probably do associate it with funerals. And yet this is the scripture that we have during this Lenten season. And I think that, one, it's important to think about this during the Lenten season to start with. And then on top of all of the added complications and fears and difficulties that are going around right now, I think that this is an even extra special reminder of how God guides us into a better place with him. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a great place sometimes in terms of physically, or a great place emotionally all the time, but a better place in his presence. For sheep, who David, when he's writing the psalm, is first reminiscing about, even though he changes his topic a little bit later, for sheep, their life was a dangerous one. They probably didn't realize it other than to know when danger approached, but their life was a dangerous one. And the life of the shepherd was even more dangerous. The shepherd was the one who saved the sheep from falling off cliffs or getting into their own difficulties, and protected the flock against thieves, protected the flock against predators. So the shepherd made sure that the sheep survived, even if maybe they experienced some rough times in the middle of all of that. The shepherd tried to prevent the sheep from wandering off and getting injured, or tried to prevent the sheep from maybe getting in the jaws of a predator. But even if they did get into those situations, the shepherd was always there to make it right, to help heal the sheep after they got into a circumstance, to fend off the predator whenever that predator was noticed. So this is a reminder in this time that not everything's going to be perfect. Not everything's not going to be dangerous for us sheep of the Lord, but a reminder that God has us in his hands, in his protection. God is guiding us and God is defending us. The other scriptures that I posted today are scriptures that talk about who Jesus is. The psalm was written before Jesus existed, but it also speaks to that very same nature of Jesus as guide, as guardian, as protector. The text from Ephesians speaks of Jesus as the light. In the dark times, light is obviously one of the best things you would want. Before you would want anything else in the dark, before you would want to know where your shoes were, to know where your coat was, you would want light. Ephesians speaks to Jesus as light. The John passage that I posted, that's definitely too long to read here, is a passage about giving sight. Giving sight to a person who was blind, and then giving sight to the people who challenged Jesus and who said there's no possible way this could be the blind man. Giving sight to those to see who Jesus is in not only the blind man's life, but also our life. All of those passages together speak to the light of God present even in the darkest of times. Right now we're in a circumstance where we don't know when this ends. So we don't know when the darkness comes to an end in terms of the darkness of lack of social interaction, the darkness of not being able to meet for church, the darkness of being worried about whether we get to go to the store today or don't get to go to the store today, or find what we need at the store today or don't. The darkness still surrounds us, but we remember that God is the source of light. He is the source of guide. Psalm 23 says, even though I walk through darkness, even though I walk in the deepest valley. A valley was a dangerous place even if it wasn't dark. In the time of the early Christians, in the time of the Jews, there were people who would live in the mountains and who would attack people in the valley because it was very easy to target people in the valley. If you think of it, you're trapped down the valley. Everybody can fire down on you, weapons, rocks, things like that. If you're trapped in the valley and you can't climb up the sides of the valley, you're no longer able to get out from whatever might be coming. There were villages that were built in a valley, and then rains came along, created flood situations, and wiped those whole villages out. Valleys were places that were very advantageous to someone who might want to harm you, and not very advantageous to you who might be walking through them. So even if you ignore the dark imagery in Psalm 23, you already have an image of a valley as a place where it's scary enough to walk through it to start with, because you don't know who or what may be waiting for you, and who or what has the high ground advantage. So the imagery that David is conjuring up in the first portion of this psalm says, I don't know what's coming. I can't see far enough to know. I can't predict what could be coming at me, but what I do know is that God goes with me and attempts to guide me in the best path possible and defends me when I make mistakes or when evil surrounds me. That's what we hear about the rod and the staff. The staff was likely a hook that would pull a sheep along, guide them away from things, and the rod was likely the weapon that they would use. Sometimes they were one and the same. Sometimes one was made out of firmer, more material than others. Sometimes it didn't have a hook, but they were similar items that the shepherd would either use to fend off attackers or to kind of guide sheep along. They weren't generally used as weapons against the sheep, but they were used as weapons against predators, thieves, things like that. So what David conjures up is this image of God guiding us through this valley and also protecting us in the midst of it. In the case of our scripture from Ephesians and our scripture from John, it's another reminder that God is a guide. Light is a guide in the darkness. I know that right now, as I'm recording from home, I've had to get very creative with light because these videos would be very dark in my home if I didn't find light sources from all different places. It would be kind of a very dark and depressing video if I filmed with the normal light sources that are in my home. I'm reminded of the presence of light. Light reminds me of my guide. Light reminds me of the presence of someone in the darkness. So as Psalm 23 and this Ephesians and this John story conjure up these images of Jesus, we are reminded that there is something else out there that is guiding us onward. We're not in this alone. It's going to feel like it, particularly because we're kind of stranded almost from those we would normally connect to, but there is someone going with us and guiding us and following our footsteps to protect them. We are in unusual times. As Christians, we have experienced something here and now that hasn't been experienced in any way previously. We are reminded right now of our social nature And even those of us who may prefer a little alone time are probably starting to get to the point where we wish we could go somewhere, anywhere. What we're finding from people who are recommending doing things during this time is to not let your mental health go. If walking in the woods helps you and you can do it by maintaining that appropriate social distance, go for it. If you need to get out and find something to do outside of your home, it's still okay to do that as long as you're maintaining distance from other people. So this is a good time to revel in the nature of the Psalms, to find the trees and the rocks and the brooks, the creeks or cricks if you're from where I am, to find God in even the most difficult and dark of times. We're challenged to find him in the nature around us, kind of like sheep. We're reminded of that pastoral meaning like fields and sheep herding lands, pastoral position or pastoral images of God. We are being challenged to find new ways to be the church. I challenge you to write to people that you haven't written. If you haven't mailed anything out in a long time, I challenge you to do so. In doing things like this, like writing to people that you normally wouldn't write, or calling people that you wouldn't normally call, or volunteering if possible to shop for someone who can't shop for themselves by reaching out, we are also called to be those guides. What Jesus gives us as a gift of protection and a gift of guidance, we also are called to do for others. So Psalm 23 is a reminder not only of God's protection in the midst of the valley, but also our position in the midst of the valley along with others. Do we just walk along and ignore the difficulties that are coming others' way, or do we also act like shepherds of God's people? It seems really easy to do the shepherding thing when we can meet in church. So this is why there are new challenges ahead of us to be shepherds, to be light, to be the presence of God in this time. So I challenge you to find one new way to reach someone that still practices safe social distance, so that we are acting as the presence of God, just as we hear that promise in Psalm 23, in Ephesians, in John. Just as we hear that for ourselves, we are being that for others. One of the things that we as Christians hear from Psalm 23 is also the latter portion of it, where his imagery shifts from shepherding to a banquet. And this banquet imagery is echoed throughout the texts, throughout Scripture. It's echoed throughout Jesus' own life, including the Last Supper, which we're, of course, coming closer and closer toward in the season of Lent. And the image here that David sets up is still not an image of perfect safety. David is saying, he prepares a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Now, most people would not sit down and be vulnerable if there were people who would attack them. Most of us would not be comfortable eating dinner anywhere if we thought a robber was going to break in, or that someone was going to come into the restaurant and try and steal money. Most of us wouldn't consider ourselves safe to eat. It's one of those things that we kind of do when we're relaxed, when we're okay, when we feel protected. As a matter of fact, we see it reflected in the animal world. Animals that will attack others and bring them down, or even animals that are eating plants, will always do so only when they feel safe to do so. So the imagery that David's bringing up in this latter half of the psalm still reflects the first portion of the psalm. He changes metaphors, but he keeps the same imagery. I feel safe enough to dine. I feel safe enough to do the things that I would normally do, even in the presence of disaster, because you are with me. Jesus is with us even in this time of disaster. so we can be reminded that we can go about those daily things. We can enjoy meals with one another. We can enjoy the normal things of life while knowing that God guides us and protects us. One of the ways that he does guide us is guide us to listen to leadership that knows what's going on. He says that in the Bible to make sure that you pay attention to your leaders, because a part of how he guides us is making sure we make wise decisions. So for those of us who feel like we are kind of trapped, maybe a wise decision would be to find a way to get out of that just temporarily, safely. For those who may feel like they're okay to go out and about, maybe the wise decision is finding another way to limit and to step back. For those who still have to go to work, for those who are still in the circumstance where they don't have a choice, maybe a wise decision is practicing more hand washing or touching your face less. There are lots of wise decisions that God guides us in, even in a time where it seems like spirituality is far from you, where it seems like all of the connection that you had to God just went out the window with the bowling alleys and the hair salons and the restaurants and the water parks and everything else like that. And so we're reminded that even in the midst of turmoil, we still do the things that keep us centered, that keep us grounded, that keep us human, that keep us in some way connected to one another. So the Psalm and the other two texts this morning are reminders not only of how God is with us in the midst of difficulty and how he is our guide and our protector, but also how we are called to be like God in this way and to be the guide and protectors of others in this time. It can become so easy to focus in on ourselves and not focus on others right now. So the challenge for you this week as we move ahead in this time of limiting connection physically with one another is to find a new way to be connected to someone else, maybe virtually, maybe by mail. There are a lot of free conference call websites. If that's something you would like me to set up, I can absolutely do that. But we are being challenged in this time of physical isolation, not to let others feel isolated, not to let others feel unprotected, not to let others feel unguided, even as we can no longer meet together. We have the spiritual connection with others, and we can have other forms of connection with others. So this week, as you listen to the hymns that I have put before you, as you pray the prayer that I have put before you, as you pray other prayers, as you spend time in devotional, be the guide and guardian for others, but also remember that God is guide and guardian even in the midst of this unsafe, unsure time. Let these words be a promise, but also a comfort, which is how David originally wrote these. The idea that this was a comfort. He was in the midst of trouble and he's comforted by this, but he's also moved into action and doing. He's not waiting on God. He's still traveling through the valley. He's still sitting down at the table to eat. So we don't just wait. I mean, in some ways we're waiting for this to pass, but we don't just wait for church to return. We instead be the church and be God to others. So this week I ask you to challenge yourself to reach someone, maybe someone you've never called before. Maybe if you want to scan down the phone book and call someone you've never spoken to in your life, to find a new way to reach out and connect and be guides and protectors for others as God guides and protects you. As always, if you need anything, I'm here. I'm still keeping my office hours open until the health department advises otherwise. I want you to know that God is still with us, even in these challenging times, and to be able to answer any questions or concerns you might have as well. Blessings. See you next week.